"You're lost, Grandpa." The words sliced through the chatter of the mess hall, drawing every eye to the corner where Walter Hayes sat alone, an old man with a face mapped by decades, his pale eyes calm beneath a crown of silver hair. Plates clattered, the scent of scrambled eggs and bacon mingled with the hum of fluorescent lights. Yet Walter remained untouched by the noise, a quiet island amid the chaos. Ethan Cole, a young SEAL with a grin stretched wide, leaned back against the metal table, arms crossed, mocking, scanning the room for an audience as the others chuckled nervously. "Come on, old man. What was your rank?" he called, voice loud, tinged with amusement and disbelief, expecting laughter to ripple through the mess hall. Walter's hand paused over his cup of black coffee, fingers brushing the ceramic rim. He did not look up, did not flinch. Silence, almost imperceptible, began to build, a tension crawling over the linoleum floor. Ethan's grin faltered slightly, noticing the way Walter's gaze seemed to absorb the light without reflecting it, calm and steady, unyielding. A few Marines exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to be heard. "Yeah. What's your rank, really?" Walter finally set the cup down, the faintest scrape against the table echoing like a gunshot. His lips parted slowly, voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of countless untold stories. "I answered to nobody." A ripple of laughter erupted around the table, yet Walter's stare never wavered, a stillness that made the laughter hit like a wave against a rock. Ethan's eyebrows shot up, disbelief flickering across his face as he leaned back, forced to reconcile the tiny, fragile figure before him with the weight in that voice. A young Marine at the next table nudged Ethan, whispering about the unusual coin on Walter's jacket, a small bronze circle glinting in the fluorescent haze, engraved with symbols that seemed alien in the bright mess hall. Walter's fingers touched it lightly, almost reverently, and in that instant the room seemed to tilt, the smell of coffee and toast momentarily replaced by a distant memory of a forward operating base in the Pacific decades ago, sweat, sun, and the silent discipline of men who had known fear and honor in equal measure. Ethan shifted, uncomfortable, eyes flicking toward the silent figure, the laughter dying down into murmurs. The faint, almost imperceptible click of a coin against its case drew the attention of Senior Chief Mason Reed, standing near the exit, his expression tightening as recognition dawned, muscles coiling with sudden urgency. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper, scanning the mess hall, tracing the path of that small, bronze coin. The air thickened with expectation, a collective pulse slowing, as the young SEALs began to notice the stillness radiating from Walter Hayes. Ethan opened his mouth to speak again, but the words seemed to choke, caught in the sudden awareness that this was no ordinary man. Somewhere behind the scenes, a flurry of communications sparked into life, the chain of command quietly igniting, officers murmuring names into secure lines, the words spreading faster than the scent of hot bacon. Walter remained seated, serene, sipping his coffee, as though the world outside the corner of the mess hall did not exist. Yet every pair of eyes was locked on him, every mind straining to reconcile the ordinary sight of an old man with the extraordinary authority that now hummed through the room. The tension was palpable, a silent countdown to revelation, each second a taut string, ready to snap. Walter Hayes sipped his coffee slowly, eyes fixed on the far wall where the sunlight glinted off the stainless steel counter, the air thick with the smell of scrambled eggs and burnt toast, yet he seemed untouched, a still point in the chaos. Ethan Cole shifted on his bench, glancing at his comrades for support, but noticing only uncertainty in their faces, a subtle hesitation that had not been there moments ago. He leaned forward, voice lowered, attempting to reclaim control. "Come on, old man, tell us where you served." Walter did not look at him, fingers tracing the rim of the cup as if reading a secret message written in the grain of the ceramic. The room seemed to hold its breath, trays clattering against tables, the sizzle from the kitchen softened to a background hum as conversation paused unconsciously. A young Marine nudged Ethan, whispering about the small coin glinting on Walter's jacket, an unfamiliar emblem engraved deeply, catching the light with every subtle movement. Ethan's gaze locked on it, curiosity mixing with irritation. "What is that, a medal?" Walter's lips curved faintly, just enough for the corners of his mouth to suggest a memory, and he gestured toward it with a hand that bore decades of work, service, and discipline. The mess hall felt suddenly smaller, the chatter replaced by a quiet hum of awareness as other SEALs leaned closer, drawn by an instinct they did not fully understand, sensing that this was more than an ordinary old man in their midst. Walter tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly as if peering into another time, a flash of a sun-baked desert, the hiss of distant helicopters, the heavy air of a forward operating base decades ago. Ethan swallowed, the confident smirk faltering, noticing the unwavering composure, the subtle authority radiating from Walter, unspoken but undeniable. Senior Chief Mason Reed stepped forward, his expression hardening, eyes darting to the coin and then back to Walter, recognition dawning in silent increments. The hum of whispers grew softer, replaced by a tension that threaded through the air, every gaze subtly shifting, weighing the old man who refused to meet theirs, whose calm held more power than their jokes or rank. Walter adjusted the sleeve of his worn jacket, revealing just enough of the coin's intricate details to catch Mason's trained eye, triggering a series of quick, almost imperceptible movements as Mason reached for his phone, dialing numbers with controlled urgency, his voice muted but firm, conveying a message that quickly propagated up the chain. Ethan's pulse quickened, the levity of moments ago evaporating, replaced by the quiet awe of understanding creeping into the room. The mess hall now a stage of anticipation as Walter remained seated, an island of composure, every motion measured, deliberate, commanding attention without a single raised voice. The subtle click of utensils, the shuffle of boots on linoleum, even the faint hiss of the coffee machine seemed magnified, punctuating the slow realization that the old man before them carried a presence far beyond the silver hair and lined face, a history unseen but palpably felt, a quiet force that had already begun to bend the room's dynamics before a single word had altered the course of the conversation. Senior Chief Mason Reed stepped away from the gathering crowd and moved toward the far end of the mess hall where the noise from the kitchen could cover a quiet conversation. His phone was already in his hand. He glanced back once at Walter Hayes. The old man had not changed position. He still sat alone with his coffee, surrounded by dozens of curious eyes, yet somehow untouched by the attention. Mason lowered his voice. "I need a verification on a challenge coin." The person on the other end sounded confused. Mason understood why. Nobody called command over a coin. But this was different. Every instinct earned through 24 years of service was telling him something was wrong. Or perhaps something was very right. Behind him, Ethan Cole watched the exchange with growing frustration. The situation was slipping away from him. 10 minutes earlier, he had been entertaining his teammates. Now nobody was laughing. Several of the younger operators were staring at Walter as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. Ethan stood and walked closer. "You still have not answered my question." Walter slowly lifted his eyes. They were pale blue beneath the bright lights, calm and unreadable. "I did answer it." Ethan folded his arms. "Nobody answers to nobody." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave the slightest shrug. "That depends on the job." The response landed strangely. It was not defiant. It was not proud. It was simply factual. Somehow that made it more unsettling. Around them, conversations continued to die. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the television mounted above the serving line seemed distant now. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. He carefully placed it beside his coffee cup. His movements were slow, deliberate, practiced. The kind of movements that came from a lifetime of discipline rather than age. Ethan noticed something then. Walter never seemed uncomfortable under scrutiny. Most people shifted when dozens of eyes settled on them. Walter did not. He looked completely at ease, as though crowded rooms and intense attention were familiar territory. Across the room, Mason listened to the voice on the phone. His expression changed immediately. "Repeat that." Silence followed. Mason turned slightly away from the room. "Are you sure?" Another pause. Then a simple answer. Mason's jaw tightened. "Understood." He ended the call but did not move. For several seconds, he simply stared toward Walter Hayes. The color had drained from his face. A second call arrived before he could react. Mason answered instantly. This time he said almost nothing. just listened, then stood perfectly still. When the call ended, he slipped the phone into his pocket and took a slow breath. Ethan noticed. Everyone noticed. Mason Reed was not a man easily shaken, yet something had clearly rattled him. He walked back across the mess hall. The operator stepped aside without realizing it. Mason stopped beside Walter's table. His voice was respectful now. Very respectful. "Sir." The single word sent a ripple through the room. Ethan blinked. Several operators exchanged confused looks. Mason never called strangers sir. Walter looked up calmly. "Yes, Mason." The senior chief froze. A few operators stared in disbelief. Nobody had introduced them. Nobody had spoken Mason's name. Yet Walter had known it instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Somewhere beyond the walls of the mess hall, engines hummed, doors opened, and a chain of events already in motion continued climbing higher through the ranks. The mess hall seemed to breathe differently now, a subtle shift that made every clatter of silverware feel louder, every murmur of conversation slower, more deliberate. Ethan Cole straightened, trying to regain a sense of authority, but the atmosphere had changed, like walking into a room where the gravity was different. Walter Hayes sat unmoved, hands wrapped around the cup of coffee, eyes scanning the room with a quiet awareness that seemed to measure every intention before it reached action. The other operators exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their laughter from earlier now gone, replaced by an unspoken tension. Walter slowly reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the small, bronze coin Mason had noticed earlier. He held it between aged fingers, the engraved emblem catching the light and reflecting it back with subtle brilliance. Every eye in the mess hall followed the movement, some instinctively leaning closer, drawn to the quiet authority radiating from him. Mason Reed stepped slightly forward, subtly signaling to Ethan without drawing attention, his expression tight, a recognition flickering that suggested more than familiarity, an understanding of history hidden from the others. Walter placed the coin gently on the table, the soft click resonating, a sound that carried more weight than it seemed, grounding the room in anticipation. Ethan leaned over, attempting to assert himself again. "What is that coin for?" Walter lifted his gaze, meeting Ethan's eyes with the steady composure of someone who had seen far too much to be shaken by a question. "It is a reminder," Walter said softly, voice carrying across the quiet hall, "of duty, of commitment, of the things that cannot be spoken aloud but must always be honored." A hush fell. Even the kitchen staff paused, trays suspended midair, the sizzle from the griddle fading as if the room itself had shifted focus. Ethan's smirk faltered, curiosity wrestling with unease. He gestured toward the coin. "You served somewhere important, did you not?" Walter nodded slightly, letting the gesture speak, not elaborating, his eyes still calm, reflective. Mason Reed's eyes narrowed, studying the emblem with precision, recognition dawning like a light in a dark room, a signal that triggered a sequence of silent communications that began to thread through the higher levels of command. The younger Marines exchanged whispered speculations, realizing for the first time that this man, sitting quietly with nothing but a cup of coffee and a coin, carried weight far beyond their understanding. Walter leaned back slightly, the motion subtle, but enough to suggest that he had anticipated every glance, every murmur, every assumption that had been cast upon him. Ethan swallowed hard, shifting his weight, sensing that the dynamic had changed entirely, that control had subtly shifted from him to the old man who had not spoken more than a handful of words yet held the room in a quiet grip. Mason Reed, maintaining a composed exterior, slipped his phone into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Walter, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that this was more than routine. The other operators began to sit straighter, some fidgeting, others stilling completely, as if waiting for an unspoken cue. The mess hall, once a noisy, chaotic room filled with chatter and clinking dishes, now seemed suspended, held in the tension of history and authority, every breath measured, every movement deliberate, each person sensing the weight of experience that Walter Hayes embodied, a presence that spoke louder than words, commanding attention simply by being. In that quiet, Ethan's bravado felt small, and the air carried the unmistakable awareness that something profound had been set into motion, the old man at the table holding the room in a stillness that demanded recognition and respect, unseen yet undeniable. Walter's fingers rested on the bronze coin for several long seconds. The room remained silent, every conversation stalled by the strange gravity surrounding the old man. Then, without warning, one of the younger operators standing nearby leaned forward for a closer look. He was barely 24, curious more than disrespectful, and his eyes fixed on a small scratch running across the face of the coin. "What happened there?" he asked quietly. Walter looked down at the mark. For the first time since entering the mess hall, something changed in his expression. It was not sadness. It was not pride. It was memory. The fluorescent lights reflected in his eyes as though another place had suddenly appeared beyond them. The smell of coffee faded. The clatter of trays disappeared. For a moment, he was somewhere else entirely. The scratch had not come from where. It had come from a steel equipment case on a remote airfield more than 40 years earlier. The night had been cold. Wind had pushed dust across a runway that officially did not exist on any map. Young men moved through the darkness without unit patches, without names, carrying responsibilities that could never be discussed outside secure rooms. Walter remembered standing beside a transport aircraft with its engines humming softly beneath a moonless sky. He remembered a senior officer pressing the coin into his hand. "If this mission succeeds," the officer had said, "nobody will ever know. If it fails, nobody will know that either." Walter had nodded. There had been no speeches, no applause, no cameras, only duty. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived. The mess hall returned. The scent of bacon and coffee filled the air once more. Walter blinked slowly and looked at the young operator. "A long time ago," he said simply. The answer only deepened the mystery. Across the room, Mason Reed felt his phone vibrate again. He stepped aside and answered immediately. This time the voice on the other end sounded different. Sharper, more urgent. Mason listened in silence. His eyes widened slightly. "You are serious?" he asked. A pause followed. Then came the response. Mason glanced toward Walter and lowered his voice. "Understood. I will keep him there." He ended the call and exhaled slowly. Ethan noticed everything. "What is going on?" he demanded. Mason did not answer immediately. He looked around the room before speaking. "You should probably stop asking questions." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Mason's gaze settled on Walter. "Because I just learned that 3 separate command offices are trying to locate him right now." The statement landed like a stone in still water. Several operators exchanged stunned looks. One nearly dropped his fork. Ethan stared at Walter, struggling to reconcile the quiet elderly man with the reaction now spreading through channels far above their pay grade. Walter, meanwhile, simply lifted his coffee and took another sip. Calm, unhurried, completely unconcerned, as though admirals, commanders, and secure phone calls had nothing to do with him. Yet somewhere beyond the walls of the building, vehicles were already moving. Staff officers were changing schedules. Meetings were being interrupted. And a name that had not been spoken openly in years was beginning to travel through the chain of command once again. Walter Hayes remained seated, the coffee cup now half empty, fingers lightly tracing the rim as he watched the room respond in subtle waves to his quiet presence. Ethan Cole shifted on his stool, eyes darting between the old man and Senior Chief Mason Reed, who stood rigid a few steps away, glancing occasionally at the mess hall doors as though expecting someone else to appear at any moment. The hum of the ventilation system and the faint clink of trays from the kitchen became background to the tension that now occupied the room, every Marine and operator subtly aware that something beyond their comprehension had been set in motion. Walter's hand moved slowly, retrieving a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of his jacket, the kind of paper that carried authority without fanfare. A document that had been sealed for decades and only known to those with the highest clearance. He placed it on the table deliberately, fingertips brushing the surface as he positioned it carefully, the edges aligning perfectly with the cup and coin. Ethan leaned forward, curiosity and defiance struggling in equal measure. "Is that important?" he asked, voice slightly louder than he intended, drawing a ripple of attention. Walter tilted his head, eyes calm, steady, and unshaken by the collective scrutiny. "It is a record of service that was never meant to be discussed," he said softly, letting the words carry their weight through the quiet hall. Mason's gaze flicked to the document, recognition sharpening in his expression. The name at the top was not only familiar, it was legendary. His lips pressed into a thin line as he whispered under his breath, "It cannot be here." Walter did not respond. He simply sat, unhurried, letting the presence of the paper speak louder than any words. Ethan's bravado began to falter. The laughter from moments ago had evaporated entirely, replaced by the collective realization that the old man before them carried authority, skill, and recognition far beyond anything visible on the surface. Operators and Marines shifted subtly in their seats, some glancing at one another, as if silently questioning how a single man could command so much respect through quiet presence alone. Walter finally folded the paper back into his jacket pocket, the motion unhurried and precise, signaling closure, yet leaving the weight of its significance lingering in the air. Mason took a slow step toward him, hand resting briefly on the edge of the table, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, conveying understanding without words. Ethan exhaled sharply, tension coiling in his shoulders, and for the first time in the encounter, he realized that control had shifted entirely, that authority could exist without overt demonstration, and that Walter Hayes embodied it fully. The room remained charged, silent in anticipation, every operator aware that what had unfolded was more than protocol or rank. It was the presence of history, experience, and unspoken accomplishment manifesting quietly, profoundly, and irreversibly in the simple act of sitting, watching, and existing within the mess hall. The phone on Mason Reed's belt vibrated again, and he caught it instinctively, eyes never leaving Walter Hayes. The young SEALs and Marines watched the interaction, sensing that something significant was unfolding without a word being spoken aloud. Mason's voice was low and measured, conveying only the necessary information to the person on the other end, yet the impact of his words rippled across the room as operators leaned slightly forward, trying to catch subtle cues. Walter remained calm, his posture relaxed, hands resting lightly on the table, observing the room as though seeing everything while remaining entirely unshaken. Ethan Cole shifted uneasily, realizing for the first time that control had slipped from his grasp. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation, every sound amplified. The scrape of a chair, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the soft clink of a coffee cup. Mason's eyes darted briefly toward the mess hall doors, noting movements outside, the subtle approach of others responding to his earlier calls. He ended the call, letting a long pause fill the space, and the silence seemed almost deliberate, as if the room itself held its breath. A glance between Mason and Walter conveyed more than words could capture: acknowledgement, respect, and recognition of experience that had been earned through decades of service in situations most of the young Marines could scarcely imagine. Walter leaned slightly forward, voice quiet but deliberate. Some things remain classified until the moment they are needed. Ethan blinked, trying to reconcile the ordinary appearance of an elderly man with the authority that now seemed palpable in the room. Mason's gaze swept over the assembled operators, subtly instructing them to remain attentive, to recognize that this encounter was more than it appeared. The younger SEALs exchanged glances, a mixture of awe and confusion reflected in their expressions, as they realized that their assumptions about the old man had been completely mistaken. Walter's hand rested once more over the coin in his jacket, a silent gesture, and Mason took note, a flash of recognition passing across his features. Outside the mess hall, footsteps and muted conversations indicated that command staff and officers were mobilizing, responding to the information Mason had relayed moments earlier. Inside, the air remained tense but controlled, the hum of anticipation unbroken. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came. The room seemed to contract slightly around Walter, the focus sharpening as if time itself had slowed. Mason took a measured step back, giving Walter space while remaining vigilant, his stance both protective and reverent. Walter tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning the room, absorbing the subtle shifts in attention, the hesitant movements of operators who were beginning to grasp the significance of his presence. The mess hall was no longer just a dining space. It had become a stage of silent recognition, each person aware that history and authority were quietly asserting themselves, that the ordinary appearances of a man could conceal extraordinary significance, and that every small movement, every subtle gesture, was now loaded with weight and expectation. The faint clatter from the kitchen returned gradually, yet it did not disrupt the gravity of the moment. Walter sipped his coffee again, slow and deliberate, and the young Marines instinctively straightened in their seats, aware that they were witnessing more than a man drinking coffee. They were witnessing a living embodiment of experience, discipline, and command quietly shaping the room, without a single overt display of power. The sound of footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor, faint at first, then growing louder as Admiral Jonathan Pierce entered the mess hall. Walter Hayes remained seated, hands folded lightly over his coffee, calm and collected, as though he had anticipated every motion and decision before it happened. Ethan Cole froze mid-step, eyes widening, realizing that the senior officer's presence altered the entire dynamic of the room instantly. The chatter that had returned moments ago fell silent once again, replaced by the subtle, heavy hum of authority radiating through the space. Mason Reed moved slightly aside, giving the Admiral clear sight lines to Walter while maintaining his own respectful distance. Walter's eyes met the Admiral's as if acknowledging a bond formed long before the younger operators had even been born. The bronze coin glinted under the fluorescent lights as Walter adjusted it subtly, and Pierce's gaze immediately landed on it, recognition flickering across his features. Operators and Marines straightened in their seats, some instinctively adjusting their posture, others holding their breath, sensing the weight of history and service now fully present. The Admiral walked slowly toward Walter, each measured step filling the room with the unspoken gravity of rank, experience, and long-hidden achievements. Walter remained motionless, his demeanor still, his composure unwavering, a quiet authority far older and deeper than anyone in the mess hall had encountered. Ethan swallowed, struggling to reconcile the frail appearance of Walter with the potent respect now commanding attention. Pierce reached the table, eyes narrowing briefly on the coin, then lifting to meet Walter's steady gaze. The room seemed to contract around the two men, the space between filled with decades of unspoken understanding and service. Mason Reed signaled subtly with a tilt of his head, a silent acknowledgement that the chain of command had converged precisely at this moment, and that recognition was now complete. The mess hall was no longer a simple dining area. It had transformed into a stage where history, experience, and authority intersected, each observer aware that the ordinary elderly man before them carried a lifetime of accomplishment that demanded acknowledgement without a single word of explanation. Walter raised his hand slightly in a simple, understated salute, and the Admiral responded immediately, crisp, precise, and weighty, a recognition that sent a ripple through the room. Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came. All eyes followed the interaction, the energy thick, taut with the silent understanding of those witnessing the convergence of experience and command. The fluorescent lights reflected off the coffee cup and coin, casting a subtle glow on Walter's lined face, the wrinkles now seeming less about age and more about decades of wisdom earned in places and times that very few had seen. The mess hall held its collective breath as the silent exchange continued, each person realizing that the balance of authority had shifted fully, subtly yet unmistakably, from the young operators to the quiet, steady figure who had already commanded the respect of those far above their pay grade. The mess hall remained frozen, each operator holding a position they had assumed without realizing it, the air thick with anticipation and reverence. Walter Hayes set his coffee cup down with deliberate care, the subtle clink echoing lightly through the room, drawing attention not to sound but to presence. Ethan Cole, still seated with hands slightly trembling, struggled to absorb the total shift in authority that had quietly overtaken the space. Every operator, young and old, now understood that Walter's calm had been more than patience, it had been command. The soft hum of the ventilation system and the faint scrape of a chair became the backdrop for something heavier, a collective awareness of history and achievement. Mason Reed, standing near the door, exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving Walter, a silent acknowledgement of the magnitude of the moment. Outside the mess hall, distant footsteps and the subtle hum of vehicles signaled that Admiral Jonathan Pierce's presence had mobilized attention beyond these walls. Within, Walter's hands moved lightly to adjust the coin resting on the table, the bronze glinting under the lights, a quiet emblem of service that spoke louder than words. Ethan's attempt at humor from earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by a nervous curiosity, a sense of humility that came with realizing the depth of experience before him. Mason stepped slightly forward, hand resting on the table edge, offering no words, only a stance of recognition and respect, a conduit of authority that acknowledged Walter's significance without needing to articulate it. The operators leaned slightly forward, drawn into the unspoken dialogue, aware that a single gesture, a glance, a simple motion, carried decades of unvoiced history. Walter tilted his head, eyes sweeping across the mess hall, acknowledging each observer, each reaction, the subtleties of attention and realization as the room absorbed the quiet weight of his presence. The fluorescent lights glinted off the coin and coffee cup, highlighting the contrast between ordinary appearances and extraordinary reality. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again, words failing him, replaced by a stunned silence that filled the gaps between chairs, tables, and the soft footsteps of Mason Reed as he shifted position. The mess hall was no longer simply a place to eat. It had become a theater of recognition, a space where authority, history, and respect converged in subtle yet undeniable ways. Walter lifted his hand slightly, a gentle, understated salute, and the room responded instinctively. Heads inclined, bodies straightened, a reverent hush enveloping every corner. Ethan felt the weight of the moment, realizing that respect and command did not require loud declaration, only presence and consistency, and that Walter Hayes had long since mastered both. The Admiral's footsteps grew nearer, yet within the room, the silent acknowledgement of Walter's history had already settled like a tide, wrapping each observer in understanding and awe, the quiet moral clear to anyone who had eyes to see and ears to hear. Some names do not need introduction. The people who matter already remember them.